My Family History by Margaret Demeline. Granddad Abbas. My granddad Abbas, whose name was Edward Abbas and was known as Ed, was very proud that his family came from Germany and France. While Abbas was an ancient name originating in the Middle East, Granddad had never heard about that origin. His branch of the Abbas family evidently lived in France for hundreds of years and married French women. The earliest ancestor Granddad knew of was his great-grandfather, who was born in France in the late 1700s. Then the family moved to Germany and settled in Saxon. Weimar and Jordan or Godan were the other names of places he remembered hearing about, and might have been small German communities where they lived. His grandfather was born in Saxony and married a German woman. He had a son named Sebastian, who was born there in 1825. After Sebastian finished high school and learned to become a stonemason, he married Catherine Hess, who was a young German woman from Wittenberg. These names of German towns were recalled by Granddad in his last years, as he remembered hearing them from his father many years before. While I have used the spelling as he remembered it, Weimar could possibly have been Weimar, which was the intellectual heart of Germany at that time, and Wittenberg might have been Wittenberg, where Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses on the church door. In 1848, when he was 23 years old, Sebastian and Catherine immigrated to America to escape military oppression, as Germans did at that time. Evidently, their strong religious beliefs kept them from accepting German military requirements. In the United States, Sebastian and Catherine settled in Pennsylvania with other German families, and that is where Granddad Abbas and his older brother Jim were born. They lived first in Lancaster and then much longer in Tipton, a small community about 4 miles from Tyrone. It was located between the Allegheny and Brush Mountains and was an ideal place for boys to grow up. Their house was on the Juniata River, with only a road between the house and the river, and the Penn Central Railroad ran on the other side of the river. In his last years, Granddad still enjoyed talking about that house, which he described as a 2-story rock building with 4 rooms downstairs and 5 rooms upstairs. There was a cellar and a big fireplace, and the inside walls were covered in plaster. Sebastian worked for the railroad as a stonemason and helped to build Horseshoe Bend on the Pennsylvania line in the Allegheny Mountains. This was considered a construction marvel, and the stonework done on it is reportedly as sturdy as ever 150 years later. Sebastian was so proud to have been a part of this. Sadly, though, Catherine became ill with typhoid fever and died at age 38. It was especially hard for Ed to lose his mother, but before long his father married another German woman who became a good stepmother. Her name was Mary Ann, and she and Sebastian had a baby girl named Carrie. Ed was very fond of his pretty little sister. After 30 years in Pennsylvania, Sebastian moved his family to Texas in 1877. Stories had been circulating for some time about the abundant opportunities in Texas. As the poet Margaret Coit wrote, "Man told of a land where the green grass swept down to the sea, with only a line of foam to show where one ended and the other began. Men told of a sea of green grass that swept straight to the horizon and rolled into great waves when the wind blew. Men told of nights bright as day, when huge stars and glittering fireflies turned the prairie into blue fire and bathed everything, wild rose and geranium, every blade of fine wiry grass in effervescent light. Men told of a lone star hanging over the horizon, leading them on to new dreams and new hopes. Men told of a great country, fresh from the hand of God, Texas." So Sebastian brought his family to this new land in search of new opportunities for his sons and himself. He bought ranch land from the state for $4 an acre, located on Mustang Creek, about 15 miles east of the new town of Cleburne, and he and the boys built a small but adequate house on their land. It was rolling prairie covered with that great Texas grass, along with some mesquite trees, and they began raising cattle. Ed was 16 years old, and he took to the role of cowboy right away, along with his older brother. This was the time of the big cattle drives, and a branch of the Chisholm Trail ran near Cleburne. So after about 2 years, Ed and Jim joined one of these drives to Kansas City with their cattle. There were usually several thousand cattle on a drive, about a dozen men, and 80 or more horses. Indians followed the herd much of the time. It was a rough and dangerous experience, but very exciting for a teenager from Pennsylvania who reminisced about it for the rest of his life. Jim liked Kansas City so much that he decided to stay there, while Ed returned to the family in Texas. Sebastian had joined the newly organized Masonic Lodge in Cleburne soon after his arrival in Texas, since it had been an important part of his life in Pennsylvania. The Masonic Lodge had begun in the Middle Ages as a society of skilled stonemasons joined together to promote brotherly love among the members, and later included others not connected with the building trade as honorary members. After only 3 years of ranching, Sebastian developed severe bronchial trouble and had to move into Cleburne. He died there 2 years later at 58 years of age. The ranch was sold sometime after this. Ed stayed in town to take care of his stepmother and sister and began doing carpenter work to support them. He also became a member of the new Cumberland Presbyterian Church in Cleburne, which had recently built its first building on Anglin Street. This would later become the Anglin Street Presbyterian Church, affiliated with the Presbyterian Church USA and known as the Northern Presbyterian Church. A few years later, after his father's death, Ed's stepmother, Mary Ann, married a Ragsdale and moved to Fort Worth, while his sister, Carrie, married Jess Shaw and moved to his hometown in Weatherford, Texas. In 1886, Ed married Harriet Ann Killow, known as Haiti, and built a home for them next to the house where her widowed mother and her younger brother lived in Cleburne. I will tell more in the next section about Hattie and her family background and her life with Ed and their children. He continued doing carpenter work and became quite a craftsman, teaching Hattie's brother, Will, to work with him. New opportunities would be opening for these skills in a few years. By 1888, Cleburne had become one of the principal railroad points in the whole Santa Fe railroad system, with 4 divisions of the railroad ending there. Then, in 1899, the economy of Cleburne took a giant leap forward when the Santa Fe Railroad built their central machine shops there. The extensive shops helped double the population of Cleburne and remained the main factor in the town's economy for many years. This was where the Santa Fe maintained and repaired all of their trains for a large part of the country. A huge roadhouse was built in the center of the shops with stalls for working on 36 steam locomotives at the same time, stripping them down, repairing them, and putting them back together. If an engine needed a new part, they didn't order it from somewhere else. A machinist would build it right there on site. They did just about any and everything. There was a saying that they could push a tree through one side of the building and end up with a desk on the other side. This was where Ed went to work in 1901 and would spend the rest of his working life. He soon became shop foreman and then a foreman or supervisor in the roadhouse, making a comfortable living for his family while enjoying his work till the very end. I have a faded receipt for $80 for a Surrey and black mare that Granddad bought in 1903 when he must have been getting on his feet financially. Then he bought one of the first cars when they became available in Cleburne, and one of the first radios in town. I vaguely remember hearing about, or maybe being there, when he excitedly called all of the family to come and listen to amazing sounds from a strange little contraption. He loved all kinds of gadgets and mechanical things, as well as repairing and building things with wood. His workshop in the backyard was stocked with all the tools he could need, many of which he made himself by hand. It gave him such joy to pass on his skills to his only son, my father, at a young age, and watch him become a craftsman too. Times did get bad in 1922 when there was a workers' strike on the Santa Fe shops. Disgruntled workers marched through town carrying clubs, and some became violent. Since Granddad was part of the management at the shops, he was determined to cross the picket line and go to work. but this was so dangerous that my father insisted on going with him. Permission had to be gotten from the sheriff for my father to carry a loaded pistol while escorting Granddad as well as his friend and fellow foreman, Jim Lusk, who was my mother's father. Jim was a large man, while Ed was rather small, so with Jim's size and the protection of the gun, they made it safely across the picket line. However, many were injured, and the governor had to send in the Texas Rangers to keep order. The Rangers patrolled the courthouse square with rifles drawn until the workers settled down. This was a scary time that the man talked about for years to come. Granddad kept in touch with his stepmother after she remarried, and she came from out of town to visit regularly. My mother told me about getting acquainted with her when marrying into the family and described her as the cutest, jolliest little German woman she had ever seen. Granddad's half-sister, Carrie, was also a family favorite. As a child, I can remember visits from Aunt Carrie and Uncle Jess and their two beautiful blonde daughters. I was so impressed with these older cousins and thought they were very glamorous. The oldest daughter married a lawyer in Weatherford, while the younger one wanted to go into show business in spite of her parents' opposition. She began modeling in Fort Worth and singing with Jack Amlong's orchestra at the Crazy Water Hotel in Mineral Wells, a popular health resort near Weatherford. The orchestra had a national radio broadcast, and that was where Mary Martin, also from Weatherford, got her start in show business. Carrie's daughter didn't make it out of Mineral Wells, but she did find a wealthy husband there and finally lived happily ever after. Unfortunately, we lost touch with this part of the family after Granddad died. By the time I was old enough to remember, Granddad Abbas was retired and weakened by leukemia that eventually took his life, but I never heard him complain or express any frustration. He was a gentle, kind, patient person who just seemed to become quieter as his illness developed. He lived by a very strict code of morals and was strongly opposed to cursing, liquor, and gambling. He did not even approve of using playing cards or dice in any games, but he liked to play dominoes. He enjoyed talking about growing up in Pennsylvania, his days as a cowboy, and old times in Cleburne. At the same time, he was interested in discussing current events and business news with my father. Grandmother and her daughter, Kate, who lived with them and cared for them in their old age, also participated in these discussions. One end of Grandmother and Granddad's bedroom was used as a sitting area with their rocking chairs on each side of the stove and other chairs to be gathered around for visitors. It was very cozy and conducive to talk. They even listened intently as I told about my activities as a child, describing what I was doing in school and reciting poems I had learned. And as I got older, reading papers I had written. Any handcrafts I had made were also examined and praised far more than they deserved. On Sunday afternoons, my father drove Granddad and Grandmother around Cleburne and into the surrounding countryside while talking about who owned what property and what was being done with it. It was my privilege to go with them most of the time and to listen to them talk. Sometimes we drove by the old ranch that Granddad's father had owned, and all felt a touch of sadness. On most of those drives, we ended up at the Cleburne Cemetery, working on the family plots, reminiscing warmly about the relatives buried there, and about other old families as we walked among the plots and talked about the meaning of life and death. There were also Sunday afternoon visits with Grandmother's younger brother, Will Kilo, and his wife, Myra, who lived just down the street from my grandparents and had no children. Those conversations centered mainly on business matters in Cleburne, since Uncle Will was a partner and a partner had owned a furniture store there before he retired. Even after he was paralyzed by a stroke and unable to speak above a mumble, he was still interested in keeping up with the local news. Aunt Myra read the little Cleburne newspaper to him word for word each day, except for the society news. Then he wanted to hear my father elaborate on it all, and I got to sit in on most of those conversations. These Sunday afternoons with my father and his elderly relatives gave me a lifelong interest in business and politics, as well as in farming and ranching and in family history. At the same time, I was given valuable lessons in the practical application of morals and ethics, for which I am very grateful. As his health declined, Granddad made frequent trips by train to the Santa Fe Hospital in Temple. The Santa Fe provided excellent health care for its employees, and the hospital, started by the railroad, eventually became Scott and White Hospital, named after the two organizing doctors. That is now one of the top hospitals in the U.S. Granddad came home to die, and all of the family gathered around his bed to be with him at the last. He was 77 years old. This was my first real experience with death, and I was 14 years of age. It all seemed very peaceful and natural, but I still remember the great sense of loss that I felt. After the funeral home prepared the body for burial, it was returned to the home in the casket, according to the custom at the time, to lie in state for 2 or 3 days before being taken to the church for the funeral. Friends and relatives came to pay their respects and to sit with the body. It was customary for 2 or 3 visitors to sit by the body throughout the night, and a list was kept of friends and relatives who volunteered for each hour during the night. This was considered a way to show respect for the person who had died, as well as for his family. Pallbearers were chosen with great care, and it was an honor to be chosen. Mr. A.T. Lohman, the superintendent, the head man of the Santa Fe shops in Cleburne, was one of the pallbearers for Granddad's funeral. He had a special connection with our family because both of his grandfathers, my father's father, as well as my father's father, my mother's father, were foremen or supervisors under him at the shops. Also, Mr. Lohman was chairman of the board of directors of the bank where my father was the managing vice president. He thought very highly of both of my grandfathers as well as my father, and reminded me how fortunate I was to have such fine grandfathers and such a fine father too.